How are Aussie researchers bringing us closer to scalable quantum computing?
And is Sony's PlayStation Classic a winner?
Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin. Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined by a man who, like many people in Sydney this week, has been building an ark in his backyard, Alex
wood.
Kidman, as we go behind the headlines in search of the big picture. We're also joined by longtime friend of the show and man of many talents, Seamus Byrne, who is managing editor of Innovation Australia, Aussie correspondent for the Esports Observer, and the host of the new Blizzard gaming podcast, The Scrapyard. Seamus, welcome to the show. Did I miss anything on your busy schedule?
Look, I'm sure you did. I have another new show called Jetpacks Are Overrated, which people could look up. And there's more things in the works because, you know, when you decide, coming back into the tech sphere after a bit of a break in pure science, you have to do everything rather than just one thing.
So you've got an album dropping in time for Christmas?
Oh, you know it.
This week, we're looking at efforts by Aussie researchers to scale up quantum computing, as well as Sony's new PlayStation Classic console. But first, over to the Vertical Hold news desk. Alex, what's new in tech news?
NBN Co's latest report into the economic impact of the national broadband network suggests that it's been very good for female entrepreneurs. The Connecting Australia Enterprising Women report looked at the impact of the NBN for women working from home, finding that in areas where the NBN has already rolled out, employment grew at twice the pace of non-NBN areas and 5 times that if you're a woman looking to work part-time from home. It's almost as if fast broadband enables new business models or something. I mean, who would have thought that?
Australia's piracy hunters are setting their sights on Google with changes to site blocking laws to extend them into search blocking laws. Google is amongst those opposed to the changes to the current law, and the search giant is particularly concerned about the section that it claims will have the effect of removing the federal court's direct oversight over the site blocking process and instead leaving it up to businesses to decide which websites Australians can and can't visit.
KO Sports has officially launched, and as expected, it's available for browsers, Chromecast, and in app form. It's also got Telstra on board as an official launch partner, but that only extends to you being able to add the sports streaming service to your existing Telstra bill, with no sign of a discount or, for that matter, any kind of quota-free deal. That's probably not an issue if you're watching at home, but it'd be wise to keep an eye on your mobile usage to avoid excess data bills.
Australia's proposed new encryption laws continue to cause alarm within the tech sector, with a lobby group for the country's biggest tech firms warning that tech companies could possibly choose to leave the Australian market to avoid being forced to install spyware on their devices and networks at the request of intelligence agencies. Speaking with SBS News, the Communication Alliance head John Stanton warned that encryption reforms would see its members confronted with difficult choices. And he says the industry sees a range of problems with the legislation and that it would be a threat to the cybersecurity of all Australians if it was rushed through Parliament in the next fortnight.
So, Adam, it's time once again for Vertical Hold to take to the piracy. And in this case, though, presumably Australian pirates are getting ready and gearing up to start using Bing a whole lot.
Yes, who would have thought it? Finally, there's a use for Bing. Yes, they've been blocking piracy websites for a few years now, and they kind of claim it's working. They bragged about the fact that it had reduced piracy by half, which of course conveniently ignores the fact that half the people haven't been stopped. But now they think that's not good enough, so they actually want to block it in search results. They want to block it in auto search, which means instead of going to the ISPs, they have to go straight to your search engines like Google and say, hey, we want you to block this. Now, as you can imagine, Google's not too thrilled about that. Seamus, how do you think this fits into the big picture of privacy and, you know, freedom of movement on the internet? Will this make any difference?
Yeah, look, I think there's 2 aspects to this, right? One, the 50% reduction in piracy. You always wonder how much of that just ties into the fact that we finally got around to having a good range of streaming services in Australia.
Yeah.
That means people don't need all that content that they couldn't otherwise get before. So, that's one big aspect of it. But the other is that I think, look, when we talk about China in terms of their firewall and then how, companies sometimes bow to the way in which that China wants to implement censorship and different kinds of sort of technology like this, they're also a massive market, right? Like, so those big companies are kind of willing to bend over a little bit in order to twist their way around and let the things happen in order to have access to, well over 1 billion people. Australia is 25 million people. We are not the kind of country that a major international corporation is all that willing to change entire infrastructure processes in order to just keep a very, like a very kind of positive Western lucrative kind of a high-end market, but a small market nonetheless.
Although if Google is listening, obviously, we've got lots of uranium and we're prepared to use it. But I find it interesting you bring China up because obviously that's an area where Google doesn't actually do a lot of business. They have pulled back because of, citing reasons of privacy, although quite how accurate that is remains to be seen, really. I guess the other issue here, though, is this problem of if you implement this, what does it do to legitimate search results? Because honestly, and I don't think this is any secret, I don't have an awful lot of time for people who pirate content. And as you said, Shay, there's so much available content out there. There's more than most people could watch. But I think there are going to be plenty of instances where people may have legitimate searches that are going to get captured in this kind of net in the same way that this kind of filtering software always has unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to block certain terms. When you're blocking websites, you can pick a URL and you say, all right, I want you to block piracy.com, and it's done. And if that's done, then Google searching for those websites is not going to help you because then when you try to go there, it won't work. So obviously people are searching for other places where they can get the movie that they want. So how are you going to block search results? Are you going to block someone when they search for the name of a movie? Are you going to block someone if they search for the name of a movie and then the word download? Like, it's going to have to be such a generic way of doing it that, as you say, it's almost impossible that they won't get false positives and block people who aren't actually trying to steal stuff. But Seamus, how much do you think that pirates actually rely on Google?
I mean, so little. Like, quite honestly, you don't just go and type into Google latest episode of such and such show, or actually, weirdly, if you do, I remember we were hunting for an episode of So You Think You Can Dance, right? The American dance reality show. No Australian broadcaster has been supporting it anymore. And eventually I think we watched it through the Fox website in America using, a VPN type thing to just pretend we're in America, right? But in the end, we watched American ads and all that jazz. But what was funny was the number of weird video services, I guess, that are out there that just, because they're not YouTube, I guess a lot of times they just fly under the radar. So there's certainly those kinds of services out there where people do just upload it to, like, the Daily Motions of the world and these sorts of, slightly more obscure YouTube wannabes. But in the end, I think like Alex said as well, I think that we've hit that point where there's so much content available. It's hard to sort of necessarily have all that much sympathy on one hand, but it is just about the fact that this stuff doesn't work. When the people really want to go and find the things and share the things that they want to share, then they're using torrent services and all sorts of, like software packages to do these kinds of distribution systems with private search systems attached to them and not just the open web.
Well, that's not how our good friend Graham Burke from Village Roadshow sees it.
Of course he doesn't.
Graham's always been known for his level-headed comments when it comes to piracy. On this latest thing, he says that Google's, and this is pretty much a direct quote, Google's sole interest is using a treasure trove of stolen movies as part of attracting people to a business model that is strengthened by theft. Google autocomplete and searches are used to steal movies. This is no different from stealing a loaf of bread from a 7-Eleven.
You wouldn't steal
go.
a car.
No, but you download one. So, Seamus, quantum computing is one of those buzz phrases that's regularly thrown around, but Australia's really leading the way in helping it become reality. Now, of course, I could explain this quite easily myself, but I wouldn't want to make Alex look bad. So, Seamus, you're a learned man. You're a former managing editor at Science Alert. Can you explain us through this latest quantum computing breakthrough that they've made at the University of New South Wales and what's so important about it?
I will do my best.
All right, listen closely, Alex. There's a test at the end.
So, look, the primary sort of breakthrough that they've made. So probably step one, the team at UNSW, led by current Australian of the Year, Michelle Simmons, has been focused on the idea of actually doing silicon-based quantum computing. So it's really about trying to sort of create a far more scalable form of quantum computing that, down the track could start to be the kind of quantum computer you could start selling as a computer to different kinds of businesses and things, instead of right now where IBM and Microsoft and Google are building, trying to build these like mega quantum computers, but pretty much go, and then you can buy time on our quantum computer because it's just this, monolithic giant refrigerator, basically, where it's doing incredibly deep frozen technology to isolate atoms in a way that you can then start to observe quantum effects that are applied to those atoms in order to basically get out of the classical computing idea where you have one bit, and that bit is either a 1 or a 0. In quantum computing, you start to, by dealing with single atoms, you can start to essentially have the 1 and 0 variations, but then also superpositions that exist in between 1 and 0, based on where electrons are currently sort of sitting in the position around these specific atoms. So you start to actually get to a completely different sort of version of computing where it's no longer that sort of binary concept, right? And the thing about it is that it becomes exponential. So instead of, let's say, if you've got 8 bits in a traditional computing system, and that's just a line of ones and zeros, all of those ones and zeros, can only create one 8-bit number, in any given moment. That's all they can ever be. Whereas in a quantum computing system, and this is where you get into the crazy side of what quantum craziness can mean, is that it can actually represent all of the potential numbers within that range simultaneously. And so you really do that. Instead of thinking of it as, just that sort of 8-bit concept, you start to actually be more of a 2 to the power of 8 instead of just 8 bits. And this is
sort of like Schrodinger's bit. It's there, but it's not there.
Yeah, and that all of those, those relationships between all of those quantum bits, or qubits as they get called, becomes this whole different thing, to the point where, I think, this classic mathematician, and quite a good science writer, but Paul Davies, he wrote a paper quite a while back where he pointed out that if you had a quantum computer that was 400 bits or 400 qubits, that would actually be the point where it breaks the information, essentially this information limit of the entire universe because of that sort of exponential factoring. So, it's like, well, clearly we're probably not going to get to that point, or hey, one day wouldn't that be a fascinating moment if science breaks the information limit of the entire universe?
But this stuff's not just science fiction anymore, is it? We're not arguing about if we can build quantum computers. What we're trying to do is figure out the effective way to actually, build the economic way to make it a reality.
Yeah, and what it's applied for and things like that. And the thing about the silicon system that is a really important point is that all of these machines, like Google technically has, I think, a 70 qubit system. IBM's might be 50. And they're all kind of talking about how many that they've got in these single computers. But they're incredibly error prone, and any quantum state only lasts a really, really short time at the moment. But this silicon system that the UNSW team has started to work on is proving to be much more stable. And that's kind of that critical thing about what would make it something that's genuinely useful in a more sort of practical sense. So this breakthrough was about reducing the number of gates, and essentially the size of the sensor that is required to observe the atoms involved. And they'd already gotten to a point where, compared to many other overseas systems, they were at I think 4 gates per qubit was where they're up to, and they've now basically made it 2, literally one for reading and one for I'm not sure if it's writing even because of however it works, but essentially, one for each of the 2 main sort of purposes. And the other thing that they found is that this system not only reduces the space requirement, which means, again, it makes it a lot easier to kind of build and a lot easier to sort of work with, but that it also has improved the sensitivity. And they're saying the biggest thing that's going to help with is error correction, which has been that crucial problem with quantum computers. So the idea of actually now being able to say, we can reduce the size, and we also now can observe what's taking place with a single measurement, instead of having to do these sort of other complicated systems of repeating experiments and averaging outcomes and all this sort of weirdness that's been required so far. It seems like it really is a critical breakthrough in being able to move towards this path where the company that is associated with the UNSW team, their aim is to produce a useful quantum computer demonstration by 2021. This definitely keeps, or 2022, sorry, and this keeps them on the path to achieving that. And again, I guess that other part of what quantum computers are for, this isn't just about going, so I guess it runs a bit faster than my current laptops. It's about entirely different kinds of computing that right now the biggest supercomputers in the world try to do and will, crunch numbers on for months and months. These sorts of systems, can be that massively parallel concept where literally everything can be represented simultaneously. It's incredibly good for massive simulation type things, like it might be for weather systems or for other kinds of massive scientific calculation processes. And lots of those kind of really big, like machine learning systems and lots of things like that try to do millions of things at once.
I'm glad you mentioned the timescale there, actually, Seamus, because I'm always a little bit nervous whenever I see a headline that has science and breakthrough in it.
Yeah,
because there's an awful lot of reporting that, to be fair, it's trying to kind of simplify it down for the common man, but which kind of suggests, right, well, we'll all be, flying around in our jetpacks next year, in fact. So 2021 is the aim, but is it really going to happen? But my inner cynic says that I've certainly been reading about quantum computing, and not so much reporting on it, but reading about it for some time now.
Yeah, look, I think the kind of work that this team is working on, I think it, and again, when we talk about the idea of them, selling quantum computers in 3 years' time, I think it really starts to be more of a question of, they might sell $5-10 million computers to people, that year. That I'm sure it will be about, again, really specific applied versions, of what this is made for. And I think there will probably be that era of the equivalent of the IBM mainframe versions of quantum computers for a long time, where it is, a company buys it because, the Bureau of Meteorology buys one because it's going to make, sort of weather reporting far more accurate, and then universities have some for their, big number crunching purposes. And then, maybe then, 10 years, 20 years down the track, we start to find more everyday applications for what this might actually mean. But definitely at the moment, this is about, breakthroughs in this research phase of even just working out, is this going to be viable as a genuine thing that's worth pursuing? Because there's plenty of people who also think, in parallel to this, more traditional computing systems keep getting better too. And, companies like NVIDIA, are killing it by saying, all this work we did on inventing graphics cards has turned out to be a really good parallel processing system that is really good for a lot of the similar things that quantum computing is meant to be for, machine learning and, self-driving cars and all these kinds of...
Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, Bitcoin mining. It's the
All the
Bitcoin
important
miners that
things.
made our graphics cards expensive, damn them.
So we're still a fairly decent way away from, one of Bill Gates' descendants declaring that 640 qubits should be enough for anyone then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Does Australia have an opportunity to get in on the ground floor here? Because I'm impressed that this lady who's running this research program is Australian of the Year, because this is a country that didn't have a bloody science minister not so long ago.
It was pretty spectacular.
Are we taking this seriously? And is this really an opportunity for us to maybe get in on something on the ground floor rather than just, go down the usual path of buying technology from other people?
That is the big question. There are so many times in the history of university research where our governments have failed to create an environment where they can commercialize their projects, and in turn, they end up running off to other countries. Australia used to be the leading country for photovoltaics research in the 1990s, and a whole bunch of those people ended up moving to Germany because Germany wanted to build an industry around building solar panels. And so, we lost all the smartest people in the world who had actually started doing it all here, actually also at UNSW, in fact. The fact that this has, the Silicon Quantum Computing Proprietary Limited is a company that has been set up there at UNSW as well to assist in the commercialization. And they are a company that is actually actively working on setting up intellectual property exchanges with different people doing research in the same area. They're really actively working from today to make sure that this research, that any advantage that we are creating for Australia to be ahead of the curve on this particular angle for quantum computing, that they are going to actually leverage that into building a really successful company. So that's an exciting part of what's going on at that team there. And I think we are seeing more, and now that I have this role at Innovation Australia, that I'm starting to really get up to speed on the fact that a lot, like universities are working really hard at the moment to set up those innovation hubs that actually do help researchers to convert research into viable companies. And I think we're definitely a long way forward than we were in, say, 10 years ago when it comes to the idea of how do we support research and turn it into something that actually means, it means Australia actually wins out of it and not just researchers move somewhere else who's willing to support it.
Alex, you're a man who loves sport, as we all know now because the secret is out. But apart from that, you also love classic gaming. We've got the PlayStation Classic dropping in the next few days. Is it worth getting excited about?
It really depends. And look, normally, I'm someone who goes wild and crazy about all things retro. I'd love to be able to say, yes, run screaming towards your local retailer and buy one. And to be fair, I've not had hands-on time myself, but a lot of the early reports suggest that while Sony was in a difficult position on this one, they've done a few things which actually might have made it even less appealing than it first seemed. Now, when they first announced it, they released, if I remember correctly, something like 3 or 4 of the games that were going to be on it. They then later released the full list. Almost nobody was happy with the full list. I wasn't surprised with the full list at all. And in some ways, I think they've actually done some really good and smart work there. Simply because the thing that a lot of people forget is when Sony came into the market with the PlayStation, they had a huge marketing push. They made it very hip and cool at the time. It was the console to have in the 1990s, and it shifted it from that slightly nerdy, geeky, basically me worldview of gaming to being a thing that was quite socially acceptable across the board. But they didn't really own all that many game studios. They didn't have the rights to an awful lot of games, and that's come back and bit them for the PlayStation Classic, because unlike Nintendo, where they could say, right, well, we've got all these first-party titles, and the NES Classic and the SNES Classic are mostly full of first-party Nintendo titles. Sony really didn't have that. They bought Psygnosis, for example, and there's a few of those titles there. So that was always going to disappoint people. But now it's also emerged that what they've done with the PlayStation Classic is instead of using their own emulator, which they've run on the PlayStation Portable and the PlayStation Vita, and is a lovely little proprietary thing, they're using an open source one. Nobody seems to know why. But they're also using a really weird mix of PAL and NTSC copies of these games. And if you were around at the time, you might remember PAL and NTSC. They're kind of irrelevant now in the main. NTSC is the US and Japanese TV standard of its day. PAL was what we had here. If you were French, you had CCAM. But the difference there was in the speed of refresh. And basically for gaming, PAL games ran slower than NTSC. Now, when you hook up a PlayStation Classic, it's hooking up via HDMI. It doesn't give a rat's about PAL or NTSC, except that they've provided the PAL code. So a bunch of the games, including a number that people are going to want to play, are going to run substantially slower than they should. And weirdly, this isn't just the European market gets this. This is worldwide.
Okay, yeah, I can see why a few people would be unhappy about that one. Seamus, you're a long-time gamer. I assumed you had a PlayStation 1 back in the day when they were just called a PlayStation.
I didn't.
Really? Oh well, thanks for joining us.
The door is
Tune in
sir.
next week.
I played it. I coveted
I feel
it.
betrayed at this point. Are you really a science writer as well, or did you just make that up as well?
See, I was mostly a PC gamer through the 1990s. Thanks very much. And then eventually, PlayStation 2 was the first ever console I actually owned. But yeah, I played the hell out of some of these games as well. And I mean, one of the things like Alex was talking about there with the selection of games and people being disappointed by it, I think, Alex, you're right in that, I look at this list and go, if they had Parappa the Rapper on here, or if they had, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, which of course, is an Activision title and would have been incredibly difficult for them to get rights to, I have no doubt. But all those kinds of things are one part of it. But another part is going, we've got Original Oddworld, Puzzle Fighter Turbo.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Tekken 3, Resident Evil, Ridge Racer. We've got kind of a whole bunch of these games that part of me wonders if they left off a couple of the really obscure, weird things. Like, would that have actually made people happier? Because it seems like some people are focusing more on just the weird handful of titles that are on there that make no sense if you're making it like the best 20 games ever type list, versus going, well, we could have given you 12 games that every one of them would have looked like it was a pretty great game, but we've also given you 8 more games just for the sake of giving you.
They should have called them bonus games, and then everyone would be happy with it.
Yeah, right?
I'm a Colin McRae man myself. I'm a bit disappointed that Colin McRae's on there, but again, I think it's to do with rights.
Yeah, and I mean, the weird little games are, of course, the ones that I like. You cannot please everyone.
Yeah.
And I'm slightly annoyed because there's a title on the Japanese version of this thing, Devil Dice, and it is one of the best PlayStation games ever. If you haven't played it, you absolutely should. But you can't unless you import one of the Japanese ones. But we do get some oddities, and there are, I guess, the flip side of this is if you haven't played some of these games, some of them do still stand up well. And the PlayStation sits in that funny era of 3D gaming. And Seamus, you would have been through this, in fact, with PC gaming in the 90s as well, when 3D graphics were the new hotness, but they generally did look pretty bad. The frame rates were not good. And game devs didn't have a lot of ideas of what to do with them beyond, well, it's got to be in 3D. They've avoided the worst of those mostly, although we do have Battle Arena Toshinden on this thing, and I wish we didn't. But I still think there's some value here. I mean, I'm informed subtly that one of these might be sitting under the Christmas tree for me this year, because it's the kind of thing that I get into, even though there's a reasonable number of titles in the list that I physically still own because I'm just strange enough to still own and have an original PlayStation plugged in. I think there's still value here. If you split the 20 games across the cost of the machine, it's not actually a terrible per game price. Even if you didn't like those 8 quote unquote bonus games, you could still have a lot of fun with the 12.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing here as well is on that whole graphics question, definitely this was the weirdest era for it was the awkward teenage phase because, all the old 8-bit games, they hold up beautifully because in the end, there was only, specific blocks of color information available. And so...
And in a platform game, you couldn't fall off the back of the bloody platform. Oh, God, I hated that in 3D games.
But yeah, you put it on a modern TV and, they've been able to very easily... make sure that it can still look good on a modern TV. Whereas this stuff, because just suddenly when it's at a much bigger size and the resolution is awkwardly kind of retrofitted to a big screen, you just feel like you're looking at an absolute mess in some games on that screen. And in fact, these things... I know plenty of people who are massive retro fans. And Alex, do you still have a CRT in your house to play your classic consoles?
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
You'd expect that. But I will say this, though. I have had classic consoles plugged into a modern TV, and I'm not as fussed as some would be, but I totally get what you're saying. And in fact, for the market that the PlayStation Classic is designed for, it's sort of not for me in a way. Because I've kept playing these things. I've kept these things and preserved them. And Australia's got a really rich and vibrant retro gaming community out there. And I'm sure a bunch of them will buy one of these regardless. But it's for that wider audience who had one in the 90s and sold it and hasn't looked at it since. And I'm sure when they plug it in, those kind of rose-tinted memories of how scary Resident Evil was.
Yeah.
Or, how good the Final Fantasy VII cutscenes looked. It's going to come back and bite them a bit.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's also going to be, and this is probably where I think it will be fairly popular with certain kinds of sectors, is people who are going to pop this thing open and start installing all their other ROMs because of the fact that it is actually, using this GPL emulator. Means I think a lot of people are going to find it very easy to hack this thing so that they have this cute little classic PlayStation sitting there and it's running all sorts of stuff that they decide they want it to run instead.
This is the really open question, actually, because so far the only people who have got hold of this would be some of the early reviewers, and they don't appear to be pulling them apart. What we don't know is how much storage there is. If these 20 games are filling out the storage, are people particularly going to be interested or all that easily able to kind of cut and chop things out or add things in? One of the benefits that people had with the SNES and NES Mini, and people did this endlessly on those, was the cost of storage was so low and the file size for those games is so tiny that there was just oodles of space left over for other things. That might not be the case for these games, which originally did fill CDs, albeit that some of them kind of cheated and just used Red Book Audio to fill up the remaining space. Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Seamus for joining us for the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
And as always, we love to get your feedback on the show. Keen on quantum computing? Planning on buying a PlayStation Classic? Or have you cancelled one because you've decided you don't want one? Let us know on Twitter or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
Thanks everyone for listening. And remember, if you like what you hear, hit that subscribe button, tell your friends, and leave us a review on your podcasting app of choice. Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin.